Hello, everyone. Professor Kurzlik here. So, over the past several years, as we've been watching the Russian military intervention into Ukraine, the full scale invasion, as more recently we have been watching the US and Iran conflict on TV, there's a feeling and discussion in the news and discussion in publications that these wars are escalating, that things are getting worse and worse and worse. So, over the past few days, with the Iran and US conflict, we've seen more sites targeted, we've seen oil fields, LNG facilities. There's a front page story on CNN right now about an F 35 US Air Force jet being struck. So we see these, and it seems like the conflict is escalating and escalating and escalating. There are more strikes, there are more counterstrikes, there are warnings from leaders, more threats. Each one raising the stakes just a little bit more. So, naturally, this leads to a bigger and an important question of how do conflicts actually spire into larger wars? How do small conflicts spiral into larger conflicts? Do leaders suddenly decide to escalate, or is it something more gradual happening beneath the surface? So, in political science, there is a concept that helps explain this process, and it's called the escalation ladder. And it's the and the basic idea is pretty simple but pretty powerful. Wars don't just jump from peace to catastrophe overnight. Instead, they move in steps. Instead, they move up the escalation ladder. So, this idea and this term comes out of the Cold War. It comes out of Cold War thinking, especially from the strategist Herman Kahn. His argument was that conflict isn't just a binary choice of peace on one hand and total war on the other. Instead, it exists along a spectrum. It exists along a pendulum. Different levels of confrontation, each more intense than the last. Again, we can think of this as a ladder, as an escalation ladder. So, there are some key insights that he wrote about. States almost never choose massive war at the outset. They climb towards it. They climb up the escalation ladder. Each move is usually limited. Each step feels controlled along the ladder. Each decision seems rational on its own. But when you put those steps together, when you put those decisions together, they can lead somewhere far more dangerous than leaders intentionally set out for. They initially intended their steps to take. So let's think about this ladder. Again, it's an interesting work. It's definitely, if you like reading journal articles, it is a worthwhile piece to read. So at the bottom of the ladder, conflict is mostly political. This is where you see diplomatic tensions, diplomatic disputes, you might see sanctions, you might hear about aggressive rhetoric from one side or both. We can think about long-term tensions between Iran and the United States. We know for years the conflict has played out through economic pressure, negotiations, small-scale conflicts, and public threats. At this stage, for the most part, states are trying to send signals. They want to show they have resolve, but they are still trying to avoid direct violence. They're essentially saying, we are serious, but we are not at war yet. Most conflicts around the world do not move beyond this point. But when they do, the next step up is limited force. This is where things become more serious, but still controlled. Here we start to see maybe precision airstrikes, targeted killings, cyber operations, maybe even proxy conflicts. If you look at current events, this is where a lot of the conflicts that we see that make the news, this is where these conflicts live. When we look at conflicts in the Middle East, we've seen this step on the escalation ladder for a while now. Smaller strikes, cyber attacks, and more intense and strong sanctions. They are not attempts to completely destroy an opponent or an adversary, but they are unmistakably acts of war. So there's some logic here at this step on the ladder. Use force, but keep it limited enough to avoid triggering something larger, wider conflict. But this is also where escalation begins to really take hold, because every strike creates pressure for a response. Once retaliation begins, conflicts can widen. Targets expand. More sites are targeted. Maybe the geography of strikes expands. The scale of violence thus increases. What started out as maybe war of words turns into very limited strikes. And those strikes turn into a pattern. Actions followed by reactions. One side will act, the other side responds. And each response feels justified based on what came initially before. So this is how conflicts start to move up the escalation ladder. Not through a single decision, but through a cycle of action and response. Action and response. So we can certainly see this dynamic in multiple places today. Limited actions rarely stay isolated. They generate momentum. And over time, that momentum becomes difficult to control. So further up that ladder, we reach large-scale conventional war. At this stage, the conflict starts to resemble full-scale war between states. Here we can see sustained military campaigns, widespread destruction, and much higher stakes. The war in Ukraine is a clear example of how far conventional conflict can escalate without going all the way up to the nuclear ladder, but can escalate up the escalation ladder. We see large troop movements, heavy bombardments, and attacks on critical infrastructure, though not all the way up the escalation ladder. So when we go all the way up, at the top of the escalation ladder is nuclear use. This is not just another step, it's the threshold. Crossing it really changes everything about the conflict. The scale of destruction, the speed of escalation, and the global consequences all increase dramatically. And because of that, nuclear weapons introduced a kind of ceiling of conflict. So in the US-Iran conflict, because Iran does not have nuclear weapons, we don't hear that many stories about going all the way up the escalation ladder. But we do hear some. There are some reports, some publications and newspapers across the country about would Israel use a nuclear weapon. And a lot of people just brushed that off or said, of course not. But the fact that these newspaper articles are starting to appear at least means some people are entertaining the idea that the escalation ladder could go all the way to the top. Iran, again, does not have nuclear weapons, so it creates a situation where that response can't escalate that high with Iran, But over the past couple of years, several years, when we've looked at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, here we have seen articles and think tank pieces and public policy discussion about the conflict with Russia. If the US, if the European Union, if NATO, if the European allies became more involved, would that take it all the way up to the escalation ladder towards nuclear weapons? Because then two nuclear armed states would be in confrontation with each other. So there we can see that that is the top of the ladder. Nuclear weapons make total war. It would be the norm, or not the norm, but it would be the ending point if the escalation ladder was climbed all the way to the top. So where does that leave us today? If we step back and look at current global tensions, we're not at the top of the escalation ladder, of course. Even in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with more involvement from the US, we haven't worked up to the top of the escalation ladder. We are certainly somewhere in the middle. We are still seeing strikes and some limited strikes. We're seeing strategic signaling. We're seeing controlled use of force. But the big takeaway with the escalation ladder is that every action will receive a counteraction. And those events might seem separate and they might not seem like you're working your way up the escalation ladder, but this political science idea is that they are connected and you are slowly working your way up the escalation ladder. Thank you.